Hello.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon for some of us. Please add any important item to the agenda that you have in your mind. Meanwhile, add yourselves, please, to the attendees list. Okay, let's start. Thank you for joining us. Let's go with the agenda. Well, first of all, there are no new important issues that haven't been triaged, to my understanding. Correct me if I am wrong. Because of that, we can just go directly to the agenda items. So first of all, Josh, resource attributes, please.
Yeah, so we talked about this 2 weeks ago and gave some time to churn and think through the bug. But effectively, this started out as a bug about how do I know what labels are important from a resource to export into Prometheus. So TLDR on the issue is, we have this issue in metrics databases, not all of them, but a lot of them, that cardinality causes problems, additional labels are an issue, and like best conventions for, say, Prometheus and others are to limit the labels that you use to the minimum set that you actually need, as opposed to a lot of, like, say, tracing databases or logging databases are like, hey, attributes are your best way to get good search queries, right? So we have this conflict between those two. And to the extent that we can support both those use cases, we'd like to. So what I did was create an issue. We had a little bit of discussion. It was mostly Yuri, Josh, and I. There are two feature proposals that I think I want to make based on this. I want to run this by the spec sig for concerns, for thoughts, for alternatives. But effectively in that bug, we list out a set of requirements for user stories that we want to support. Particularly, there's this user story from the Prometheus world and from many other places where you deploy an application and somewhere in the environment, you append resources to it, or append resource attributes to it. So this would be, I want to do canary-based evals, right? That's an example. So I want to deploy a system where I give an attribute of this is my canary, and then I have my existing prod system with an attribute of here's what production is doing. And when I look at my telemetry, I can evaluate my canary against production, and I can isolate my alerts to whether it's the canary or whether it's prod, right? That's an example of adding resource attributes after the fact and appending it to telemetry. The second thing is when we define our resource detectors, we want to be holistic with all the possible like things that we could put in there, attributes that users might want to query in, say, a log database or a tracing database, right? So we want to be complete and thorough. And if you look at a bunch of the resource semantic conventions, they are. In addition, we want to know which ones are truly identifying for these limited metric databases. So we want to limit that and know, like, hey, if you know a Kubernetes kind of pod ID, you don't also have to know that the thing's in Kubernetes, right? You don't have to have an attribute that says this is a Kubernetes pod if you have an attribute that says here's the Kubernetes pod ID, because one implies the other. Okay, so this is the notion of finding your limited primitive key. And then the third kind of requirement there is that in an exporter, I can know what resource attributes are descriptive and which ones are identifying for the semantic conventions that are used in that schema. And then in addition, all of these additional labels that are added at runtime, I get in some fashion. They don't get kind of destroyed or ignored or in any kind of way, so that I can basically mix the identifying attributes and these addended attributes together and get a set of attributes for my metrics. So the proposal would be two mechanisms, two new features, okay? And this is, again, more, this doesn't have to be these two. These are just the two that I think I want to work on based on that discussion. One would be inside of semantic conventions and telemetry schema, we have a way of denoting what resource attributes are descriptive and which ones are identifying. And we update the semantic conventions in the specification to denote if something's descriptive, and all others are assumed to be identifying. We would additionally have code gen that would produce some library somewhere for these schema URLs, where I get a list of all those descriptive attributes that I can leverage inside of exporters. So code gen, or reading the schema file directly to understand this, it doesn't matter. There's somewhere in code, like at runtime, where I can grab the schema and understand what attributes are descriptive so I can prune them in my export. And Prometheus exporters would kind of leverage this by default when they do a resource attribute to Prometheus label conversion. And the second thing would be, I want to formalize a mechanism where users can do this appending of resource labels in a way where right now resource has a schema URL attached to it. Okay, so let's say we have resource has a schema URL attached to it, and we append some attributes. that are not part of that resource label, right? A user has appended them in some fashion. How does that work? What does that mean? How does it function? How do we behave? So basically expanding the specification to kind of clarify that use case and clarify what, basically this would be looking at resource merges. So those would be the two proposals that we'd put forward to solve this bug. We could work on them independently or together. I talked too much, so I'm curious about thoughts, concerns, all of the above.
Pedantic naming issue, but I wonder, we're calling this identifying and descriptive attributes, but we might use these attributes as indexes, these descriptive attributes as indexes in tracing. And I wonder if, like, are we just specifically saying some of these are metrics labels and others are not? Is that like what that means?
I mean, specific, yeah. I think this would mostly get used by metric systems because they're the ones with the problem. And the name, I'm not tied to descriptive and identifying. Minimal identifying could also be an option.
Yeah, I just wonder if calling it, you know, like a metric label or metric index or something like that, like, you know, used for metrics or some flag like that as a way of identifying them. Anyways, that's just pedantic. I was just, if it does specifically map to like use these ones for metrics and only put these other ones on your traces, that might be more direct way to speak to the end user. If we think this goes beyond just which ones did you put on the metrics, then, you know, I kind of like that. Because I don't think we're necessarily discouraging people from using these as indexes in an environment where you can handle that. We're just saying this is
no, and even for metrics, like if you're using, say, InfluxDB and you're throwing metrics in there, you can use all of these. It's only for systems where there's an issue with high cardinality and you need to limit labels, which is most of the metric systems out there, but not all of them.
And one of the requirements is all of these identifying attributes have to be low cardinality.
Yeah. Or so there's a bit where you have to accept your cardinality, right? If I'm running 10,000 machines and the only identifying attribute is like the machine ID, okay, well, that's going to be high cardinality, but acceptable.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, that, not a huge issue, but I was just wanted to poke at the use case. You're right, though. There's presumably metric systems now and more in the future that will be able to deal with bigger label sets. So maybe we shouldn't all the word metric into it. I had one other question, which was, you mentioned end users are going to be appending more attributes onto these things, and we need to know what do they mean in those cases, right? Like if users are appending more, are they intending these to be descriptive or identifying? And I wonder if like if this bubbles all the way up to the API in some level, like do we end up having to give the end user the ability to do this? I'd rather not, but you know.
My initial proposal is anything the user appends via one of these mechanisms would be treated as kind of sacrosanct, like we'd preserve it as much as we possibly can because they've gone to the effort of adding it, versus like an auto detection mechanism, right, that is provided by someone else. So anything the user would add via the environment variable or whatever other mechanisms SDKs provide would be considered identifying or crucial or core. The real concern is the resource has a schema URL attached to it. Those attributes won't be part of that schema URL. And so we have a spec issue of if we allow the user to add these resource attributes that are not accounted for in that schema URL, how do we interact with schema URLs and resource attributes at the same time for these things that fall into neither? We don't have a space for them to not be part of the schema URL. That's more what that issue is about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's over. I mean, I don't want to get into details, but yeah, if part of what you're doing is loading up a map of everything in your schema, then it's pretty easy, quick to detect that. Once you pay the cost of loading that map up, it's quick to detect that these things aren't in the map, and you can be like, all right, this is some other thing. I guess I do worry a little bit. Maybe a thing to think about here is if it's so destabilizing to change your label sets, like if we're being really restrictive here, like maybe a thing to think about when you're looking at this is we want users to not feel scared to like add attributes and resources and things like that. We don't want a situation where you've got multiple devs and one of them tacks on a new resource because they have it, and then that like screws up some operator somewhere. So that's the thing to think about, maybe with being aggressive about adding these things, but maybe that's not true. That's just the only other thing that comes to my mind is how easily does adding new resources just like knock down somebody's sandcastle somewhere.
Yeah, I guess I hear what you're saying, but I also want to throw the inverse of like, we know that that's a use case that people want, of the ability to annotate things. And so to the extent that we can specify, so all I'm proposing is we formalize it in the specification we identify holes that we have today for addressing that use case and formalize some specification PRs. Those PRs would go for full review and everything. I just want to make sure this is these two proposals are the direction to go before I spend the effort, making the proposals. So
I have two things I wanted to add.
Yeah.
So one question was, what if we ever have to give this to user? Like the user wants to introduce sort of like non-identifying key attributes, for example. I think we can hold off in the future. Maybe there's a new API that we use for defining attributes, essentially, that might like let us give that to the user, but it can be like way in the future. The other thing that's important, I think, to remember when we're talking about this particular feature is there's another way to frame the question that's not about whether attributes are actually descriptive or identifying, but is about where an attribute comes from, especially a resource attribute. And the Prometheus system has developed this very robust mechanism for applying attributes out of the process. So instead of having this resource discovery thing that you have to do, and you have to do for every repository, every language, you just identify yourself using the schema that's in use, and the system knows how to attach all of your extra resources. And it separates the responsibility of providing those resources from the application developer or the deployment of the application to being the deployment of the system and the maintainer of the infrastructure who assigns labels, which is a tried and true, and the thing that I want us to be able to give to an OpenTelemetry user, which is to say that we shouldn't necessarily focus on an extensive set of resource detectors. We should focus on clearly identifying who you are so that outside processes can do that resource attachment, which is the standard way of doing things in the metrics world. So that for me, the key here was that we can call out how to identify yourself so that other people can attach these optional resources. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, that was an alternative that was mentioned in the bug, but I didn't see a lot of consensus for it. So I would also prefer to basically say all of our resource detectors will be minimally identifying, and we attach additional labels for querying sometime downstream. But I'm highly biased based on the systems that I deal with. So I'm kind of curious, like that's one I want to hear from a lot more people before we'd push down. I just want to call that out specifically. It was one of the original 3 options and it was rejected just from lack of consensus.
Josh, I kind of suspect it's both. Like, I think we need to, like, the way we're trying to do things as OpenTelemetry is it should work while running the minimal set of components. Like, you shouldn't have to run a collector for the system to work. And so I think part of that is, yeah, thinking through like right from the get-go, how do we describe some of this stuff to a backend in some way? I do keep coming back to when we look at this, like thinking about if there is some way for an operator to load up what the heck it is they're actually using somewhere in this pipeline, then that makes things so much safer, and like that point in the pipeline becomes very useful for things like not just like statically setting up what labels do I want attached to these metrics, but also things like migrations from schema to schema, a lot of that stuff that Tigran put in. In order to do that stuff, you have to have some place where the end user said, this is the stuff I wanted. So if you see like, say, new schema come in, translate it to the old schema for this stuff, and so on and so forth. But I don't think we can just rely on that. I don't think we can say like, okay, the users are going to have to set that stuff up, or like their label sets are going to be super unstable, or like we won't solve this like super basic use case unless they set up something like that. I just feel like we probably won't be able to. It seems hard to fully solve this stuff entirely from the supply side without actually knowing what the end users want. And it sounds like what Josh is saying is in the Prometheus world, they've kind of gone that route to some degree, where somewhere downstream, there's a system that knows exactly what it's actually trying to use, and it's manipulating the data. That might end up just being in different backends, but I think OpenTelemetry should think about adding that kind of processing to the collector when we've got the cycles to look at it.
Okay, so can I rephrase what I think I just heard?
Sure.
Okay, so there's so we need to be the jack of all trades, which means users who haven't configured anything crazy should get a good default experience. But we also expect the ops to also want control. So we shouldn't rely on the one, like, to the extent we can make the default be good, we should. But additionally, we should have some hook for ops to do the right thing downstream.
Yeah.
So we want to do both of those things as opposed to just one or just the other.
Yes, I think you need to, a thing we keep coming back to is we need to provide people with a sane set of defaults, but they're also going to want to come in and change those things. And that shows up on the front end with configuration, right? There's a way to configure this stuff, which is like one way an end user could deal with it, is saying like, no, I actually want these particular resources to act as identifiers, as configuration and stuff like that. But the other place that we see this come up is without rebooting the system, the operator wants to be able to apply further configuration without having to be able to get into the configuration of an application and reboot it. And that's like another just like powerful way of doing this stuff. You know, that's why we have all this, to some degree, all this pipelining in the collector, right? Is it's like a really great place to do this kind of work. And if we're going to apply, if we're not going to have our schemas be totally like set in stone, right, then you're going to have a situation where you roll out a schema update, and that's going to change something somehow, somewhere, right? Because we said they're not just locked in stone forever. And the solution to that not breaking things is somewhere down the pipeline. You have a way to convert in places to a prior schema. And we're going to supply people with conversion tools whenever we make updates to stable schemas. But as soon as you do that, there's the question of like, well, if the user rolled out new stuff, like where and when do they still want the old stuff? And so I think the moment you start getting into any of this backwards compatibility and schema management or anything, you you have to have the end user telling you somewhere what it is that they actually wanted. So I think it's inevitable that at some point in the collector, we start looking at a way for the end user to do this stuff as like processing rules. And then if backends at some point come up with a convenient way to say, export the dashboards people are using, like most people have dashboard, most metrics tools have like a dashboard API. And I can imagine us writing tools where it's like, take my dashboard and then turn that into a set of processing rules in the collector to ensure no matter what changes I do to my apps, I'm not going to bust the data that I know I'm using in this dashboard over here. Something like that would be kind of cool. But anyways, that's just getting far afield. I think when it lay down what I see is like something we'll probably want to do at some point is have a way for end users to describe what data they're actually using. Because that makes managing stability a lot more straightforward.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's half of Prometheus rewrite rules, I think, are this.
Yeah, it's not,
or maybe more than half, maybe 80% of them. And 20% of the use case I mentioned that I think we should also support. But okay, so going forward, the two proposals that I put, do you see those in conflict with everything that we just talked about? Should I go with those two proposals or not? That's kind of what I'm trying to understand consensus here. Should I put forward a proposal for each one and we can talk about the nuances of each one individually? Or do you want to see a different direction taken here?
I think what you're talking about is first and foremost defaults. There needs to be a way to identify what out of resources, and this will also show up on attributes as well as soon as we start making metric labels out of span attributes, the thing we're talking about. Every Tuesday afternoon at the 4 p.m. Asia Pacific spec sig that people should come to. But we're going to end up wanting to say like these are these constitute a default label set, right? So like these resources need to go on there. If it's an HTTP client thing that you're counting, these attributes count as like the default label set. If you want to call that like identifying versus description, that's fine. Or like default label set might be more straightforward, maybe too overfitted. But anyways, you're defining the defaults, and I think that's good. And then the second thing we need to look at is like, well, how do you apply those defaults to make sure they're applied? So I think this is all sane. It's just the thing we'll have to do after this is like you're saying, well, how do I configure this stuff when I don't want the defaults? So we'll have to figure that part out as well.
All right, so there's basically three things we have to do then. So, but the third one we'll save for more intelligent people. Sounds good.
I think we can do that as a second pass. The first pass you're trying to do is just like, how do we apply these things? And yeah.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that. Okay, so continuing with the agenda, there's a small issue that was opened, the PR, sorry, long time ago. Please review that. If not, I will merge it. I wanted more eyes on it because it's bringing back one of the initially removed environment variables regarding OTLP being safe or unsafe. But it has been waiting there forever. It has actually enough reviews. So please take a look. If not, I will merge it probably by the end of the day. So yeah. And the second one is that there is what seems to be a very important issue opened by Ludmila regarding whether we should be cleaning up or not context objects before or after injection. And this is for supporting when you have to mix, for example, manual and automatic instrumentation, or when you have nested spans. The discussion there is getting very technical. Trask proposed that we first need to accept the fact that we have to support nested spans. It's not, I don't know how trivial this is. This doesn't look trivial for a start, but please take a look at that. I think it's important enough to pay attention to this one.
It-
By the way, it's cleaning up request objects, not context.
Okay, it's only request. Fine. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, I'm curious, how does nested spans make things more complicated when it comes to inject and extract?
So the basic thing that was trying to be solved here was a way to detect whether something else had already, like a piece of instrumentation above you had already injected the context into the HTTP request. And the initial proposal was, let's take a look at what headers are in the request right now and see whether something has already put the headers in there. But that only works if you aren't reusing your request objects, or if your request objects have always been, can be guaranteed to be cleaned up before they are reused. And the specification currently says the request objects should be cleaned up before they're used rather than after they're used. And if it's done before they're used, you don't know whether what the request object you're looking at has old headers or new headers in it.
Is this because you would not want the when we're talking about, just so people know, when we're talking about nested spans, we're saying on an HTTP client, you might have a logical HTTP request, and under that, you might have mechanical HTTP requests. Like first you did a request, then you did a retry, then you got a 300 something redirect, and so you did that. And so all of that counts as one logical HTTP request, but then you actually maybe did multiple physical HTTP requests under that.
I think it might be more if you have two competing pieces of instrumentation that have come in from two different libraries that you weren't aware that you just pulled in libraries and they had instrumentation built into them. So it's not that one is necessarily logical. It's just that, like, hey, I brought in my Netty instrumentation and coming from the library, and I brought in my, I don't know, my Vertex and instrumentation is probably a bad example because those are probably different. And they both are trying to instrument the HTTP client, and you aren't aware of it. You're just using some libraries that you pulled in, and a way for instrumentation to recognize that something has already injected the context into the request and we don't need to do it again. I think that was the idea. And this gets a lot to kind of my comment on the whole nested client spans, nested server spans, is that if we devise a system that requires instrumentation to, like, be knowledgeable about other instrumentation, this is going to be super hard to make not brittle and work consistently.
Yeah, I would be like, can we please say last write wins? And like, is that really a problem?
So this is actually what I have said, and I think this is still true. And so I'm not sure why this issue is continuing to drag on. And that is that last writes should win. Like the way that the spec is written, setters always should set. They're not appending headers, they're setting headers.
Yeah.
In that case, last write should win and it should be fine. They're both trying to inject the same context. Who cares? It should just work. Yeah.
I mean, when the situation where you double instrumented, that's a bug, and it seems like non-deterministic to me which one would be right.
Well, but whose bug is it, Ted?
It is the application owner's bug.
But they just pulled in some libraries. How can it be their bug? They just pulled in some libraries. They're not configuring anything. They're just using stuff, right?
Well, right. I mean, it's their bug to deal with. Let me put it that way, because I mean, you might say that it is in the case of a Java agent, it's the agent's bug by continuing to apply instrumentation to a future version of a library that has now started to include its own instrumentation, that particular case. But it's the application owner who's going to have to sort that out if we're applying instrumentation when we shouldn't be, right? Like the operator can't deal with that after the fact.
But I guess I want to push back on what you just said. Who knows whether we should or shouldn't be applying the instrumentation? Like that's, I think, the crux of this problem is that when I'm a library author, I'm going to write instrumentation for my library.
Right.
I'm not going to assume that somebody else has written instrumentation for some other library that I happen to be utilizing. Right. So I think that the ownership of this bug is actually extremely tricky. And if we're going to leave it up to application owners, they're going to be continually unhappy.
No, I mean, I think we should have, if we need to think about this in more detail. I keep coming back to the registry, but definitely it's the case if there's a library we're supplying instrumentation for, and then they start natively supplying instrumentation, we want them to tell us that they did that so that we can adjust what we're doing and say that this instrumentation only applies up to a max version, so that's like a human communication path that has to be there.
Yeah,
But-
that's I think a narrow case of what I'm talking about, though,
Okay.
which is two different Java libraries, both of which are assuming that they are the instrumentation of record for HTTP client instrumentation, for example. And
Yeah.
those teams aren't communicating, and we don't have any control with them. Like those are two different ones, like the Spring library and the Vertex library. It's like, Spring uses Vertex, Spring wants to instrument, Vertex wants to instrument, and you end up using both of them. Like, whose bug is it? It's everybody's bug.
Yeah.
So I think the goal would be how do we devise an instrumentation paradigm and system so that people don't run into this trouble, and so that it will solve itself, I guess. And I think that's what my goal would be, but I don't have any good solutions to it. That's just kind of what I would hope that we can end up with.
I think we have to shake out how we avoid this bug, maybe put it that way. How do we avoid this bug is an issue of documentation and convention and like spreading the word and things like that. But when you're asking like whose bug it's to put it another way, it's the application owner's problem if they have this bug, right? Like they're the person who's going to, like, once the bug exists in their system, like that's the person who's going to have to deal with it in that moment. So I guess that's what
they're unfortunately probably the people with the least information about how to deal with it.
right. But I think last right wins should hopefully.
Yeah, I think so if I recall now, the last right wins. I think that works in general. I think the issue was maybe if the second instrumentation wasn't using the first instrumentation span as its parent, then you might end up with an orphan span. But I think that's an instrumentation bug. Like, if
that's a straight up bug.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think that's probably just an issue with the instrumentation. Should always assume that somebody might have created a span and should just pull it out of the context and use that as the parent. And then I think the problem goes away. You might end up with more than one client span, but that's a different issue than bad data on the wire.
Yeah, I would think if last right wins, then generally speaking, that would mean the lowest level piece of instrumented software is going to be the one that writes last. Maybe not always, but generally speaking, you should still have like a complete graph. Anyways, we're beating this to death in this meeting. I think last right wins should work, and we should verify like why that wouldn't work.
Ted, would you mind?
Sorry,
Go ahead.
it sounds like at some point we might introduce similar thing like how we suppress underlying library to make instrumentation. For example, the gRPC over HTTP scenario. I think many SIGs, like I know, like Python and C#, like they started to have something like people use gRPC and they know it's going through HTTP. And the gRPC library owner decided for most of their users, as long as they can see the gRPC level span, they don't need the HTTP level. So they can make some flag there telling the underlying HTTP instruments like to ignore creating any span. And by default, the HTTP instrumentation, the SIG provided will respect that flag. If there's a third party providing HTTP instrumentation, they don't respect the flag, it's their problem. But in general, like internally we have a rule for different instrumentation library to compete, and there's a law like how do we follow the order. I guess this sounds like the similar problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, we haven't gotten anyone to agree on that mechanism at all. And also, like, for example, Splunk has customers who explicitly do not want to be suppressing those spans. They want to see all the details. And so we need to make sure that it's something that is configurable. Yeah. But again, there is a PR out there to try to solve this problem, and we've not been able to get agreement on what the solution is.
What I've seen is the upper level instrumentation normally give that flexibility. For example, if you use gRPC, by default, gRPC would assume that you don't want the underlying HTTP span. However, that gRPC instrumentation library will give you a flag. So you can tell the library, hey, I want to get all the details. Don't suppress the underlying library.
Or maybe the higher level stuff shouldn't over instrument things to the point that you wouldn't want that lower level data. Like, I kind of wonder, like, if this is a case where it's like actually higher level libraries should just back off a bit and utilize the data coming out of the lower level libraries rather than rewriting that information and then trying to suppress stuff. That seems, I could be wrong, but it seems kind of like grabby. Like,
it's depending on the scenario. Like some higher level library, they might use the lower level like transport for some crazy stuff. So one example I heard from the .NET team is they have Signal R, which they create a long connection that can last for a couple hours, and they do crazy stuff. They try to pull the server, and those details will be surprising to the user. So they don't want to expose that to the user by default. So it's really up to the scenario, and sometimes I feel like either way it might make sense for the user.
yeah, I mean, we're really getting into some nuance here. I think that's going to take a while to shake out.
Yeah.
A
Great
great topic.
example is the HTTP, like the request where you can send a chunk of data. So you might have a big request where you chunk things into smaller granularity. And some users, they work on the lower level, they want to see every chunk. But most of the user focusing on the business logic, they wouldn't care about that.
Sounds like a great topic for the instrumentation SIG to talk about.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I guess we can move on.
Oh, wait,
Sure.
for the response for this PR, what are we gonna document based on this discussion?
Oh, right. Good point. Yeah, I was meant to say that before. I forgot as well. Yeah, we should probably post some comments there.
I think Ted's
Ted.
assertion that last one in wins, that is what the spec says already, basically, is that the setter not an adder of headers. So I think just putting that in there and making sure that the submitter is happy with it or is okay with it. Happiness is not our goal, right? Our goal is
Reasoning, being able to reason about the
Yeah.
system is our goal.
Exactly.
I would argue.
Okay, so let's post a comment there. Ted, if you can, if not, I will do that. We can sync up.
Sure, I can post it on it right now.
Perfect. The next one is something that I am interested in. So sorry for putting that here, but we don't have any more important issues other than probably a metrics update. And is that I have this issue that I have been thinking about. I would like to identify whenever people are using actually distros, like custom Java agent or something there, to identify that this telemetry data was originated from that specific distro agent or distro service or distro client. One of the interesting things is what to do when it hits a custom collector in turn. Should that collector override the resource or should be a different label? So I will be preparing a PR just for your attention, and please comment that in the issue. If not, I will create a PR later today. But yeah, that's close to my heart. That's all. Finally, I remember in the past we used to have a metrics update. So since we have time, maybe the metrics crew could give us an update for the rest of us mortals.
Yeah, so the metrics API is already experimental, and so far, based on the feedback and the prototype, it seems there's no outstanding issue. So far, it seems to be doing a great job. And if people see any issue, please report that on GitHub. And because we have a timeline, like once we hit the timeline, we'll change the spec to feature freeze. So if anything that people think we should make a scope change, they want to add something, we should discuss that as early as possible. regarding the matrix SDK spec, originally we were planning to be a little bit aggressive and try to get the experimental by end of June, and we didn't hit the timeline. So we're putting 1 extra month and now targeting end of July, which is still quite risky because there are multiple major items. So the good thing is we're seeing good progress on the histogram part, and also like Josh Suresh start to help on the exemplar. So that should help us to spread the word. So now I'm focusing on the view part, which is the part of the SDK spec, and it has entangled with like the meter provider and the pipeline, how we export things. So we're trying to solve several problems that people reported last year, like how you can have multiple exporters and they can run on different schedule. How do you allow push and pull to run together? And how do you allow the data collection cycle to be different than the data exporting cycle? The view PR has been stuck for several weeks, and now it seems we're making progress again. So hopefully we can close on that by end of the week. I'll try to push using the Tuesday and Thursday SIG meeting, see if we can resolve all the blocking issues. And later today, I believe on 9 a.m., we're going to do a deep dive on the histogram. There are multiple important things we want to decide, like exponential versus like arbitrary buckets, and whether it's base 2 or base 10. Some of the decision will have long-term impact, which means like once we decided, it's very hard for us to change the direction. So we're taking a serious consideration, and I know multiple people are doing the prototype, and JMACD has been coordinating multiple experts to make sure we're making the right choice. And on the SDK side, I think there are still some remaining issues. For example, what are the default exporters we should support? We already have some good idea. For example, we'll support the in-memory exporter for testing and the console exporter for people to understand how things work. And of course, like the premises and probably StatsD exporter as well. And of course, we'll also support the OTLP exporter, which supports all kinds of the matrix data model we have. So we need some help to document that. I mean, if I can finish the view, I probably will go back on the API spec and focus on the hint to see if we can finish the hint API before feature freeze. Otherwise, I think most likely we'll release the stable version of the spec without the hint, because that can be an additive change. And we're not seeing this as a huge blocker, because instrumentation library can still use documentation to give you the best recommendation. Just for people who haven't been heavily involved in the matrix SIG, so just want to explain the view versus hint. So view is part of the SDK. It gives the application developer the power to do some configuration. For example, you got all the libraries that already got instrumented using the matrix API. But as a user, you want to say, I only care those 2 attributes as dimension. I don't want all the other dimensions because my system cannot afford that high cardinality, or I just don't want to pay for that. So you can change that. Or you can say, oh, I have some like counter, but I don't want the total sum. What I want is I want to change that to a histogram. I want to see the distribution. So it gives the user flexibility how they can morph one existing instrument instead of using the default result. They want to view that as a different thing. And the hint API is part of the API. The target user is the library owner who uses the instrumentation API. So we want them to be able to give the user some default configuration to make it easier, so the user by default will fall into a path of success. For example, if you're the HTTP library owner, and you probably have a lot of things to put into the attributes, like the HTTP verb, the HTTP status code, and many, many things. But you also understand that normal user, if they take all the attributes as they mentioned, they probably will just shut down the business because it's too costly. So what, as a library owner, you want to give them the hint So basically saying my recommendation is you take the HTTP verb and status code, but don't take like something like HTTP URL as a created dimension. So we believe this is a very good addition. So in this way, like the user can just configure the SDK, say, I trust the library owner, I just want the default recommendation. So this is the next thing I'm going to work on after we finish the Vue PR. I hope that helps.
For everyone else who is listening about the histogram topic, I will say that it is full of very detailed discussion right now. I would say there is a consensus that's still there about this exponential histogram being simpler than log linear. There does also seem to be a preference for base 2 as a matter just because it goes with the exponential a little bit better. If we were talking about log linear, the base 10 proposal is pretty solid. There, the last little detail here is one that's, I essentially invited the expert from Prometheus histograms to come to look at what we've done. He shared a protocol proposal that that Prometheus would be happy with, and it's pretty close to what was already there from the New Relic proposal from months and months ago. And so there's like one last detail involving, I guess, you'd call it precision near zero, which I doubt many people actually care about. So I'd say on that level, the discussion is winding down. I don't think we'll ever have these experts agreeing. My goal was to get non-experts to look at the issue and weigh in a little bit. So that hasn't really happened. There aren't that many more discussion points left there though, and at some point soon, I think a decision has to be made. It's definitely moving in the same direction as we had. OTEP 149 gave us a base 2 exponential histogram. And I think we could at that, unless something startling happens in this debate, I don't think it's going to change. And we will be hearing, I think in the next hour, from Dynatrace has to present their prototype of the histogram. So if you're interested, stay tuned and we'll have that in a few minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. I think we don't have any more items in the agenda. So let's have 7 minutes back. Go for a coffee or take a break or something. Thank you so much. Stay safe and see you next time.